Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry to interrupt your lunch conversation, but we want to get started with our final panel. They'll bring in the lunch course as we go through this final panel. Again, just to reset a couple of things, most of you, this is not your first session in the room, unless you just came for the lunch, perhaps. But in your folders, there are index cards, which we encourage you to write questions that you would like to ask the panelists through the moderator. We'll walk those up. Randy Mickens and Amy Maloney, myself, are here to collect any cards you have and get them up into the conversation. Also on social media, please keep using the hashtag MSEA Forum 15 to share your thoughts or comments from that you have about today's forum. And then finally, I encourage you to visit marylandeducators.org. Later today, all the videos from each session will be there to refresh any topic that you would like or to share with your networks of folks. We highly encourage it and appreciate it. Okay, so with that, let me introduce our final moderator and the final panel. We're joined today by Liz Bowie. Liz writes about state and local education issues for the Baltimore Sun. Since joining the Sun in 1986, Liz has covered environment, business, and state government, but for the past 15 years, she has been focused on education. She grew up in Baltimore, and her mother was a reporter and editor for the Evening Sun. Her husband, Dan Fesperman, is a former Sun foreign correspondent turned fiction author. She is a former Spencer Fellow in Education Reporting at Columbia University. And if you haven't read her recent series called Unsettled Journeys on immigrant students at Baltimore's Patterson High, make sure you do. It's pretty powerful stuff. Just don't start reading those till this panel's done, okay? All right, so with that, please join me in welcoming Liz Bowie.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad it's not freezing out and there's snow on the ground. For once, we have an easy travel to Annapolis. I wanted to start today we're going to talk about the coming years in education, which could be really interesting, actually. And I wanted to start with about 1 or 2 minutes on ESSA, because most people haven't gotten around to reading the 1,000-page bill that passed last week. So let me do that, and I'll introduce the first panelists, and then we'll go down the line. So the bill that passed generally gives more control back to the states. As everybody remembers with NCLB, the federal government dictated a lot about testing and what happens to schools that don't meet certain standards. This time, every state will have their own chance to do their own accountability system. This will start in the 2017-2018 school year. But there are some things that states will be required to do. One, they'll still have to test on 3rd through 8th grade in math and reading and have to give a test in high school in both of those subjects. They also will require some kind of, the states to take some kind of action for the lowest 5% of performing schools. However, they don't dictate what that has to be. The federal government will no longer require teacher and principal evaluations based on test scores, and which I'm sure will be a relief to a lot of people in this room. So that's a very, very quick, brief summary, but I hope that gives you some idea that in the next year or two, Maryland is going to have a lot of decisions. Maryland policymakers are going to have a lot of decisions to make about what they want their accountability system to look like, what happens to teacher evaluations, and a lot of other issues that will radiate out from that. I don't think we really know yet all of the implications of the bill, so a lot, I'm sure, will come out in the next 6 months. In any event, I wanted to start with Jennifer King Rice, who's just to my left. She is a professor of education policy and associate dean of graduate studies and faculty affairs in the College of Education at the University of Maryland. Her research draws on the discipline of economics to explore education policy questions concerning the efficiency, equity, and adequacy of U.S. education systems. She is past president of the Association of Education Finance and Policy. And we'll start with Jennifer.
Okay, I'll jump in right now. We were asked to each prepare just 5 to 10 minutes worth of remarks to get the conversation going. So I want to share my thoughts with you. First, I just want to say that I was delighted to be asked to be part of this panel. You know, what a treat to be able to step back and just think big about where our education system is going over the next 10 years. So this really is sort of a fun exercise for me, and I gave this a lot of thought and prepared some remarks that sort of map out where I think we may be headed, though no one can exactly read the tea leaves. So let me just start by saying, there's no question that ESEA reauthorization will play an important role in setting the context and the direction for the next 10 years. But it's also important to keep in mind that there are many other social and economic trends in our society that will also be key as we think about how our schools and school systems will evolve in the coming years. Just to give you a few examples, we really need to grapple with things like patterns of racial and economic segregation, some of the persistent disparities in achievement and opportunity among students from different backgrounds, labor market demands in the broader economic environment that have an impact on the teacher labor market, who chooses to teach and where they're willing to teach, as well as the knowledge and skills that we expect of our students, of our graduates in our schools. So I have all of those issues in mind as I share my thoughts with you today. And let me be clear from the outset, I've chosen to take an optimistic perspective on this. As I said, no one can read the tea leaves, but I'm laying out what I hope to see over the next 10 years and what I think is very possible given the current context. I think with respect to some issues, we're going to see a real pendulum swing, a change in direction. So, for example, assessment, particularly with respect to teacher and student performance and accountability structures. I think we may see some change there, some real change. Other issues I think will remain on a continued trajectory, but I am hopeful that we might see an increased rate of change or an increased rate of activity. So, for instance, emphasis on culturally sensitive curricula and teaching, access to high-quality preschool, more comprehensive wraparound services, and attention to the leadership pipeline. These issues have all been on the agenda, but some of them have been rather quiet and slow-moving, and I expect to see an increased emphasis on them as the educational governance pendulum swings more toward state and local control of schools. Now, I want to use the balance of my few minutes here commenting on an area where I really do expect to see some fairly major shifts in policy emphasis, and that's in the area of assessment, accountability, and teachers. So during the last decade and a half, perhaps nothing has been more influential on what happens in schools than the emphasis on test-based accountability. The use of standardized test scores to hold schools and educators accountable for the performance of students. And while few can argue with the basic principle that we ought to leave no child behind, the reality has often been heavy and punitive sanctions for schools that aren't meeting some of the astronomical standards that have laid before them. The current testing regime and accountability structures have had some positive impacts on test scores, to be sure, but they've also had some perverse effects that have the potential to have long-term consequences. So we've seen, for instance, the narrowing of the curriculum as a result of narrow tests and unlimited subjects. We've seen, in some cases, stifled innovation and limited local discretion with top-down curriculum standards. We've seen, perhaps most disturbing from my own perspective, a shortage of teachers in some of the schools that need them most. in part because, as evidence shows us, some of the very policies intended to help those schools are actually repelling teachers from them. So, we've seen some real problematic trends. As we move into the next decade, I expect to see some change in those trends. So specifically, I expect to see a greater recognition of some of the broader goals of education, including civic responsibility, democratic values, economic self-sufficiency, cultural competency, and so forth. While tests are an important mechanism for monitoring student learning and identifying problems in a timely way, they take up a lot of time in schools, and they can give a narrow and even sometimes distorted picture of what students know and where improvement is needed. So I would argue that student test scores should be, and hopefully will be, coupled with other measures of student performance and student progress to better capture some of these broad goals. Likewise, I expect to see teacher evaluation based on a much broader range of measures that go beyond the narrow value-added test scores that we've been pursuing over the last 10 years. I think the Gates project, the MET project on measuring effective teaching, is a promising direction, and we need good thinking around how to capture teacher performance in a more comprehensive way. I also expect to see a shift in how the results of achievement tests are used, a shift from high-stakes purposes, hopefully, to more formative purposes that guide both student learning and teacher improvement. I hope to see more attention given to the school leadership pipeline. In the past, we've talked much less about leadership than we've talked about teachers, even though we know that school leadership is one of the primary considerations for teachers, and there's been almost no context-specific consideration related to school leaders. What kinds of leaders do we need in schools that are performing poorly? Finally, I hope to see a policy context that is far more committed to and supportive of equal opportunity. One that includes a broader understanding of the social and economic forces that often undermine individuals' life chances, so that responses to inadequate performance, as indicated by test scores or a broader set of measures, are not chosen from a limited list of policy consequences that have been predetermined, but rather are the result of a more thoughtful examination of a school's resources, staffing, educational practices, and local context. So I'm going to stop there. I think that, as I said at the outset, the pendulum is swinging. It may be a very slow swing, but I think it's swinging in the right direction.
Next, we have Richard Collenberg, who is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He's written a number of books, one which was Tough Liberal, Albert Shanker and the Battles Over Schools, Unions, Race, and Democracy. He's also been published in many places. And a second book you might be interested in is A Smarter Charter, Finding What Works for Charter Schools and Public Education. And I'll let him tell you what the next 10 years is going to play out to be.
All right, good. Well, thank you, Liz. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Many of you may not have heard of the Century Foundation, so let me tell you a little bit about it. We are a think tank that is based in New York. I'm in the Washington satellite office. The Century Foundation was founded in 1919 by Edward Filene, whose basement some of you may have been to. We're a progressive foundation, so we're looking for ways to improve equity in American society, so it's natural that we focus much of our energy on education issues. And as we look forward the next 10 years, it seems to me that one of the biggest issues that educators will have to grapple with and capitalize on is the changing demographics of the student body. We've already reached the point where a majority of our students are now minority students, or what we used to call minority students, at least. Students of color have now become the majority. And there's a parallel issue, which is the growing levels of poverty. We're right now at the tipping point where we're close to the to the place where a majority of our students will be eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And to me, these demographic changes offer, tremendous opportunity on the one hand and challenges on the other. Opportunity in the sense that what has made our country so strong is the racial and ethnic diversity. That we have this vibrant multicultural democracy is something that gives us an edge over other countries. So I think the changing demographics of the population in terms of race and ethnicity is a positive strength and something that will help us compete in the world in the future. On the other hand, the increase in poverty rates is deeply worrying, and there is associated with that an increasing economic segregation of our student bodies, which is very, very troubling. Going back 50 years ago, James Coleman found that the biggest predictor of academic achievement is the socioeconomic status of the family that a child comes from. And the second biggest predictor was not school spending, it was the socioeconomic status of the peers in your school. And we see research evidence today that low-income students who have the opportunity to go to middle-class schools are as much as 2 years ahead of low-income students who are in high-poverty schools where all their colleagues are also poor. Now, why should it matter whether your classmates are poor or not? I think there are three things going on, and in a room full of people who know education well, these won't be surprising. The first is that peers matter. Any parent knows that, and the research evidence backs it up. It's more of an advantage to be in a school where your classmates expect to go on to college and act in that way. It's an advantage to be in a school where parents are actively involved in school affairs. And in middle-class schools, parents are much more likely to be in a position to volunteer in the classroom and the like. For example, middle-class parents are about 4 times as likely to be members of the PTA as low-income parents. Now, to be clear, I don't think there's anything about the values of the low-income parents that is associated with that difference. If it's, if you don't have a car to get to the PTA meeting, if you don't have a flexible schedule to volunteer in class, it's totally understandable why there are different levels of involvement. But it's, on average, it's stronger you're more likely to get a good education in a school where some of the parents are in a position to be involved, and that happens much less often in high poverty schools. And the final piece is the teachers, and if life were fair, low-income kids would get the best teachers, and we know that oftentimes they get the least experienced teachers in these high poverty schools. So the fact that Robert Putnam, the Harvard sociologist, has found that there is a growing, what he calls class apartheid in this country, where we're all dividing up, where rich people are separating themselves from middle-class people who are in turn are separating themselves from low-income people, is a huge challenge for education. The good news is that there is some growing recognition of this problem, and I think in the next 10 years we're going to have to deal with the economic segregation of our schools if we want to provide genuine equal opportunity for everyone. And I'm seeing a few small signs of positive or reason for hope. One is frustration with the existing efforts of school reform. Kind of the test and punish approach, privatization, has not worked very well to produce outcomes for students. And so we see this strange confluence where actually Diane Ravitch and Michelle Rhee, who probably agree on no other issue, have said that we need to tackle this issue of economic segregation. Both have recognized that this is a real problem for our schools. So now there are about 80 school districts across the country that are taking active steps to integrate their schools by economic status. To give you one example, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they don't have neighborhood schools. Every school is a school of choice within the public school system. And then they honor those choices with an eye to ensuring that the schools are balanced by socioeconomic status as measured by eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. And the graduation rates in Cambridge are off the charts. Low-income students, African-American students, Latino students are all doing far better in Cambridge than they are statewide in Massachusetts. And the white kids and the middle-class kids are doing just about the same. There's no way in which this is negatively impacting graduation rates for more advantaged students. We're starting to see more districts look at housing policy to try to ensure economic integration. In Montgomery County, Maryland, there's a inclusionary housing program where when a builder develops a certain number of units, she has to set aside 15% for low-income and working-class families. And there's a study by a researcher from Iran named Heather Schwartz who found that the low-income students who got to go to these economically mixed schools and live in economically mixed neighborhoods did far, far better over time than students in the higher poverty schools, even though the higher poverty schools were spending about $2,000 extra per pupil. So the socioeconomic integration was important. At the federal level, I know that our current education secretary, Arne Duncan, may not be that popular in this room, and the new education secretary, John King, may not be much more popular. But I would say on the issue of school integration, we may see a big change. Arne Duncan did almost nothing for school integration. And John King, when he was in New York, set up a pilot program to promote socioeconomic integration of the schools. So I think we'll see a lot more action on that front. At the state level, some of you may know that Bill Ferguson in the Assembly has introduced legislation for next generation schools, an important component of which is that they be economically integrated. He wants to provide financial incentives for schools that are between 33 and 55% low income. That is, they have a healthy mix of low income and middle class students. And part of the idea of next generation is that if we want to equip our children to navigate in an increasingly diverse society, we have to give everyone the chance to go to excellent integrated schools. When you have economic integration, that often translates into racial integration as well. So the big point I want to leave you with is I hope that we will move beyond kind of what we've had in the past couple of decades, which is really pre-Brown versus Board of Education. It's all been about how can we fix high poverty schools as opposed to how can we find creative ways through choice, not compulsion, to bring about more integration of our student bodies. And I think in the next decade, hopefully we'll be on a more productive path. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Julian Vasquez Helig, and he's a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State University, Sacramento. He also serves as the California NAACP education chair, and he is currently working on research that examines how high-stakes testing and accountability-based reforms and market reforms impact urban minority students. He, if you want to read something that he's written, he blogs at Cloaking Inequity.
Thank you so much. I also invite you to tweet at me from this presentation. I'm a tweeter, Professor JVH. Folks, we must not be bamboozled. We must not be hoodwinked. We must not be led astray. We cannot allow billionaires and neoliberals to co-opt the civil rights movement and our civil rights discourse. What we used to call discrimination, we're now calling civil rights. Let me give you some examples. Milton Friedman, the father of vouchers, said just after Brown v. Board of Education, privately conducted schools can develop exclusively white schools, exclusively colored schools, and mixed schools. High-stakes testing, folks, let's just be real. High-stakes testing was created to sort society. High-stakes tests are not an education reform. They're more than 1,500 years old. They're an import from China. China used these tests to sort their society. They first came to our country about 100 years ago from the eugenics movement. And then they were used to decide who would die on the battlefields and who would be officers during the world wars. Tests were not created for equity purposes. Only recently has this discriminatory policy been attached to civil rights and a closing of the achievement gap. Vouchers, which I just mentioned, these are not for civil rights purposes. Vouchers were used after Brown v. Board of Education to ensure all deliberate slowness. Vouchers are not for black kids, they're not for Latino kids. They're to, as Milton Friedman said, to keep schools segregated. There's other examples of this. We know from the charter school research that charter schools have very, very serious issues with equity and inclusion. Equity and access is not happenstance. The market does not create equity and access, especially when different students have different types of capital in a market. When you go into a grocery store and you'd like to buy a bottle of wine or you'd like to buy ice cream, what do you have to walk out with that item? What do you have to have? Money, capital. That's how markets function. And if you don't have that particular capital, then you cannot walk out of that market with that bottle of wine or that pizza. And so what's happened in Chile, what's happened in New Orleans, is that students that have particular types of capital, whether it be transportation, whether it be test scores, whether it be the fact that they haven't had various disciplinary actions levied against them, that becomes capital in a market. And so students that have that capital have access to the higher tiered schools. You have a market segmentation, but there are winners and losers in a market. And the research on this goes back a decade. In fact, when candidate Clinton recently made some statements about charter schools having issues with equity and access, the education reformers skewered her in the press. So we put together a brief of the last 10 years of equity and access research on charters, which clearly demonstrates that the sector has very serious issues. But for all of the top-down reforms that we've seen over the last decade, the press for charter schools, the privatization of assessment in No Child Left Behind, taking the power of assessment out of the hands of teachers and handing it over to private companies, whether it be the press for vouchers in Milwaukee and Florida and many other places, there are bottom-up, community-based approaches that we can use over the next 10 years that are alternatives to these. There are alternative approaches to teacher assessment, student assessment. There's alternatives to school closure, which Judith talked about in the last panel. So let me give you a couple of those options that I think that we could see over the next 10 years, because the common denominator of what we've seen over the last 10 years is top-down, private control, and privatization. That is what all of the, quote, education reforms have in common. That's their common denominator. The common denominator of our education policy for the next 10 years should be bottom-up, community-driven, and democratically controlled. And that is a notion that should appeal to Democrats and their beliefs about community empowerment. That is a notion that should appeal to Republicans who believe in local control. And I believe that is why ESSA goes in opposite direction that No Child Left Behind did, which was a standardized, top-down, private control approach to education policy. So for example, how many of you have heard of value-added modeling? Teacher value-added modeling. This is something that politicians love to talk about. But if you ask the average politician or staffer, explain to me how a specified value-added model and the strengths and weaknesses and the assumptions that underlie that statistical model, I suspect they will not be able to do so. Now, the researchers have said over and over to policymakers that value-added models are unstable and they're inappropriate for the uses that we're using them for. But the politicians are not really interested in listening to the folks that can actually conduct the teacher evaluation. But we know there's alternative approaches. This is a top-down, often privatized approach. It's not always that value-added models are privatized, but often you have consultants conducting these for districts. Well, we can do things like peer assistance and review, where communities and consultant teachers and actual experts conduct the evaluations of teachers instead of a statistical quantitative quantoid like me in an office somewhere. How about Teach4 America? Yes, Teach for America. If you think about it, Teach4 America has actually privatized the assignment of teachers, because they send you teachers and they say, once you've signed a contract with them, they say, here are the teachers for your community. Instead of your community determining the assignment of teachers, and of course, principals have some decision making in which Teach for America teachers they are assigned. But once you've signed that contract with Teach for America, they are privately provisioning teachers to you. What are the alternatives to that? Well, at Cal State, we have a variety of collaborative university and community partnerships to ensure that we have a pipeline of teachers that are going to go into schools and that they're going to stay. Not that 80% clip turnover that Teach for America experiences year to year. Corporate for-profit charters, KIPP and many of the others, whether they be a basis charter which has for-profit or KIPP, which is theoretically a nonprofit, there are alternatives. There are community-based charters. Travis Heights is an example of a charter school in Austin, Texas, where it was a community partnership. It was a community partnership born out of the fact that a corporate charter school made a sweetheart deal with a few board members to bring a school into the community. The community, after a year, pushed back and said no. They voted out those board members because they had democratic control of their schools. This isn't a politically appointed school board like you see in Chicago. And they created a community-based charter school with the faith community, the teacher association, the principals, the students, the principal and the students in those in that school. School takeover and district takeover schemes, as you see in New Orleans and in Chicago, these are the centers of en masse school closures. After Katrina, after Rahm Emanuel, you see schools primarily closed in African American and Latino communities, and those students are sent to low-performing schools across town. That's what's happening with the vast majority of those students. They're not offered better options. They're just offered lower quality options somewhere else that's not in their neighborhood. What's the alternative to that? One of the really, I think, promising ideas is community schools. You see this idea of wraparound services for students, because a lot of what education reformers do is they'll say to you, poverty doesn't matter, zip code shouldn't matter, so let's just ignore the challenges that students come to our school with. And there's a lot of things as educators that we need linkages with a variety of organizations across the community to deal with the challenges. So community schools does that. It addresses the challenges that schools and communities have by integrating all the resources in the community to bring to bear on those students' lives. We talked about privatized high-stakes assessment. That's essentially what No Child Left Behind did, is it privatized assessment. It turned it over to Pearson and other folks. You heard the students here saying today, we wish our teachers could create those assessments for us. You heard Dr. Neal talking about the assessment that's done at the community level. This is community-based assessment. There's no reason why Pearson and all these other companies should be controlling our assessment. It should not be privatized. We should have community-based approaches that are qualitative and quantitative evaluations of student success and school success and district success. And then finally, we've lived with a decade of top-down accountability, which is that we lived in this era where they said with NCLB, well, you know, states have a lot of flexibility. You know, you can do AYP however you want, and you can define the teacher quality, high quality teacher definition, but what it really boiled down to was there wasn't a lot of flexibility. What it was, it's kind of like you tell your teenager, you can see Spider-Man, you can see any movie you want, as long as you see Spider-Man. You can see it any time you want, as long as you see it at 2 p.m. So what choice was that really? That was the approach that No Child Left Behind took. But we also now have in California what they're calling local accountability, where it's a bottom-up community-based process with multiple measure approaches. And you see hints of this in the reauthorization of ESSA, where you have short-term and long-term plans that can include the test. I'm not the person that thinks the test shouldn't exist. I'm that person that thinks that the test should be one of many measures of the success of students and schools, et cetera. It should not be the only measure. Any statistician will tell you that the more information you have, the more sure you are about your evaluation. So I hope that over the next decade, we see a amelioration of this top-down private control, and that's been wrapped in a civil rights discourse, and instead we focused on empirically based, community-controlled, democratically controlled, bottom-up reform. Thank you.
I just want to remind the audience that you can fill out a question on an index card and pass it up, and I'll try to ask it. The first question here is, do you think the grassroots movements on schools such as opting out will help shape the future of education? I think you answered that partly, but does anyone else have Richard or
One real quick thing on this. So I was recently elected education chair of California NAACP, and one of the first things that we did was we passed a resolution in California supporting the opting out of student as a social protest, because that's what opting out is. It's a social protest that families choose to express to the state and express to the federal government that they do not believe that high-stakes tests, as currently designed, are relevant for their families or for their schools or for their communities. And I know that the civil rights community in D.C. has had challenges with this because, the Advancement Project, they're the good guys, in my opinion. And so, I think part of it is that behind the scenes there are folks, and I've seen emails and I've blogged about this at Cloaking Inequity. Behind the scenes, there are folks that are maneuvering the civil rights organizations to press for high-stakes testing. But as we talked about, high-stakes tests have never been about equity. They've always been about sorting society. So they've actually been very successful at what they were designed to do.
I mean, I think the opt-out movement is putting pressure on the larger system that I think is quite positive. If we took opt-out to its literal extreme, where no kids took tests and we didn't have a good idea of how students of different racial, ethnic, or economic groups were doing, how different schools were doing, I think that would be a problem. But I think what we've seen at this point is a growing recognition on the part of policymakers that there's real anger out there about the current system of test and punish, and that we need to come up with alternatives. So I think it's been a positive development in that sense.
the next question is for you, Richard, again, or anyone else who wants to answer it on the panel. What do you see as the essential elements of a smarter charter? Smarter charter.
Yeah. So, I did not plant this question as an opportunity to talk about my latest book, but so I wrote a book with my colleague Hallie Potter at the Century Foundation called The Smarter Charter, which wanted to go back to the original vision of charter schools. So many of you may know that Albert Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, was really one of the first strong proponents of charter schools. And he had three kind of prongs to his vision of what charter schools would be. The first is that they would be laboratories to try new ideas from which the traditional public schools would learn. So it was not competition between charters and regular public schools. It was supposed to be a cooperative endeavor, kind of a research R&D project in a way, where we would try some new techniques and see how they worked, and then bring them over to the traditional public schools. The second prong was that these schools would be places where teachers had a lot more voice in how schools were run. Shanker got the idea from visiting a school in Germany where teachers had a lot of control over the curriculum, over grouping of students by grades. Lots of educators have lots of terrific ideas that need to be tried out, and so the notion was that charter schools would be a place where teachers would have the opportunity to do that. Of course, we've gotten precisely the opposite of that at most charter schools. Only 7% of charter schools even provide union representation, which in my view is kind of a baseline for teacher voice. And we have higher teacher turnover rates in charter schools, which is, I think, probably the best objective evidence about whether teachers feel like they're being listened to. Because if you're not feeling listened to, then you exit if you don't have that voice. So, and then the third prong was Shanker saw charter schools, because they were schools of choice, as places where you could bring children of different backgrounds together. And that was true of the German school that he looked at, where you had Turkish immigrant students sitting next to German students, native German students, and everyone was benefiting from that interaction. And there are possibilities that charter schools could be more integrated, because it doesn't depend on what neighborhood you can afford to live in. In theory, at least, if transportation is provided, which it often isn't, then charter schools could be more integrated than traditional public schools. And again, the Shanker idea was flipped on its head. We know that charter schools are more segregated by class and race than traditional public schools. And honestly, that's a hard thing to be, right? The traditional public schools are pretty segregated, but charter schools have taken it to a new level. Now, in the last part of our book, and I'll close with this, we do talk about a subset of charter schools that are serving that original Shanker model. And Julian, maybe some of these are the types that you're talking about as well, the community-based schools where they have socioeconomic and racial integration as an intentional object, where they're unionized, where they provide teachers with lots of say, they have a flat structure, and where they seek to share lessons with the traditional public schools. Right now, those are the outliers, and so we wrote the book in the hope that more people would move back to that original vision that could really make charter schools partners with traditional public schools rather than competition.
Can I say a real quick thing on this? So what we did was one of the reasons why I created the blog was because a lot of times the work we do as academics is not accessible to the public. And so if you just go to Google and type in, should I trust a charter more than a used car salesman? you will see my citizen research template. You know, sometimes you have to give it sexy titles, the blog post, right? But what's actually in the blog post is a template to ask a set of questions about any charter school on relative to research based on charter schools. Because I get lots of questions about lots of different charter schools. And so when people ask me that question, I point them to this template, and there's a set of questions that you can ask about any charter school to understand if they're actually interested in equity and access.
And let me make just one last comment. Listening to Richard speak brought back this sort of the dichotomy between theory and practice. You know, when we theorize about things, and I think Richard laid out the theory of charter schools very nicely, but the devil's in the details, and then in practice, often these principles don't play out the way we would expect. And I think one of the most glaring examples of that in the charter school movement are the very large companies that operate charter schools. If you're operating a model charter school and it's implemented all over the place as that single model, regardless of context, you really wouldn't see those kinds of attributes playing out that Richard described. You know, partnerships with the local schools, places of innovation, because they're models. They're doing the same thing. So I think that's one example of sort of the charter movement gone awry.
Okay. There's another question which I'm going to read and then insert my own question in the middle of this. The state is studying and reanalyzing its education funding formula. We have something called the Thornton funding formula in Maryland, and it's up to be redone. The consultants doing the studies seem to be unconvinced that concentrated poverty makes a difference, that added resources should flow to those schools. And they view deconcentrating poverty, increasing economic diversity, as outside their scope. What should be done to connect these critical issues to funding formula reform? And I would just broaden that to a slightly, because I think that what's happened in the context of Maryland is that there is I think, very deep concern right now about the stagnation in improvement in the city schools, in the Baltimore city schools. And that has come at a time when, you know, of a year focused on the uprising that occurred in the spring. And so I think that if you talk to people in the city, they generally feel a certain amount of despair right now. I think it goes back to what you all have said about feeling that the reform movement didn't really play out as in the way that it had been hoped, that charters haven't resolved the issues either, although helped. And I think now people are searching for what is the next step. And I've heard a lot of talk about sort of integrating in terms of socioeconomics. So I wondered, I think what this question asks is, how can you get to, you know, Baltimore City is 80% farm students, and 85, somebody can help me here if they know, 85% African American. What do you do in a situation like that in terms of bringing more diversity into the city to help integrate schools? Or do you send kids out to the burbs? Are there models in the country where you use a funding formula or you use some other objective way to integrate schools?
Well, I think the first thing we should know is the reason why we're talking about integrating schools by SES is because the Supreme Court made it illegal to integrate schools based on race and parents involved. So we can thank Scalia and all those folks for the fact that we even have to have this conversation as an SES conversation. I think the elephant in the room is that we know inequality exists in our society. In any city, you can think about the beautiful schools in that city. You can think about the not so beautiful schools in that city, and we know exactly who goes to each of those types of schools. It's just very clear what's going on. It's very clear to the kids, to the students too. They understand that they don't have a football stadium, but the team across town has a football stadium and a performing arts center and a lacrosse team. They get it. They understand what society is doing to them, and they also understand that there's a lot of people out there trying to change the subject about the inequality that's going on out there. That's why we're always talking about charter schools and vouchers and all this other stuff, is because they don't want to talk about the root issue in our society, is that it's very difficult for people to send their kids to school with people that are different to them, whether it be race, whether it be SES. We have not figured that out. That's the big elephant in the room. But that's the piece, integration piece. But the other piece is the local accountability stuff actually seeks to address this. So what a lot of people don't know is that accountability and school finance have been intertwined since the beginning. When Texas birthed NCLB back in the early 1990s, it was actually in a Robin Hood finance bill. Way in the back is the way the senator described it when I talked with him about it. And the finance bill ended up being declared unconstitutional in its approach in Texas, but the accountability stuff stayed, which Bush later put on steroids, and then it became NCLB later on. So finance and accountability have always been intertwined. Now, in California, they're continuing that. And so what they're doing is I heard them talking about a millionaire tax earlier. And the politicians framed it as a zero-sum game, which is that if I take it from here, then it's something. But why shouldn't we be painting the picture bigger? So in California with Prop 30, they passed a millionaire tax. They did that. And what that means is that, well, California, on a practical level, that meant that Cal State had the money to hire faculty, right? And so the money has flowed into higher education. That's why I'm in California, is because of the millionaire tax and Prop 30. Right? The other thing that's interesting about this is that Prop 30 is also funding the local accountability plan. So they have these short-term and long-term plans, but the piece that goes with it is that accountability has all been about stick. It's always been about stick. We're going to hit you over the head with a stick. But now accountability in California has a carrot, which is that with these additional funds that are focused, they have right now accountability is focused on 3 groups: low SES, ELs, and then foster kids. And so they have to write very specific strategic plans. You could think of them as strategic plans. We call them LCAPs. And in those LCAPs, with the additional funds that you receive from the state, you have to say strategically how you're going to spend that money. And not only that, communities have to be a part of the conversation in developing those strategic plans all along the way. Now, I know this blows our mind because this is the antithesis of what we've been talking about with No Child Left Behind, right? So there is, I think, a promising approaches in California on school finance that's intertwined with accountability and is a bottom-up approach. And we have 2 academic pieces on this, and I have them posted on my blog. So if you're more interested in how Maryland can have a local accountability approach and be strategic about how the spending for specific groups of students, and there's weights and all that sort of complicated stuff that goes with this, and we can give you all that information if you're interested.
I'll just add a couple of things. Liz, I think your question identifies the key issue here, right? I think it's fair to say there's a social science consensus that poverty concentrations in schools are bad for education. So I'm not sure what these consultants are, what the research the consultants are looking at. On the other hand, there's a political consensus. I would argue it's an outdated political consensus that really there's nothing you can do about it, right? That compulsory busing, circa 1975 in Boston didn't work very well, and so let's just try to make separate but equal work. That's been what most of education reform has been about. And so I would say let me just say a quick thing on both of those two prongs. First is the social science consensus. This is a half century of research that makes very, very clear, it's international in scope, that one of the best things you can do to improve the academic achievement of a low-income student is to give her a chance to go to an economically integrated as opposed to a high-poverty school. Now, we all know of high-poverty schools that work, and there are individual ones that do a great job. But middle-class schools are 22 times as likely to be high-performing as high-poverty schools. So if we're making public policy, we can't base it on the exceptions to the rule, but rather on what's going to work with regular people, not heroic folks. And so I think to ignore the effects of concentrated poverty as we have it really makes for an educational disaster. Now, what about the politics of this? How on earth can we get it done? Especially given the logistical issues in places like Baltimore where you have 85% low income. I would say a couple of things. One is you can begin, even in high poverty cities, to develop at least a subset of socioeconomically integrated schools. So I worked with the Chicago Public Schools, which is also 85% low income, to develop a system of socioeconomically integrated magnet schools and what they call selective enrollment schools. So these are schools that middle-class families do want their kids to attend, and so we want to make sure that they don't become these islands of privilege, but rather are providing opportunities for all students. And so in Chicago, we were effective in integrating even the schools that you have to test into. Some of you may know in places like New York, the Stuyvesant schools, these top public schools, end up being, having African-American populations on the order of 1 or 2% and Latino 3 or 4% in a city that's two-thirds Black and Latino, school system that's two-thirds Black and Latino. Well, Chicago has a very nicely balanced school system with the selective enrollment schools because they're looking at socioeconomic integration. Ultimately, to make this work, you have to provide incentives for middle-class families who have options to go along with school integration. And one thing that can help is money. So in St. Louis, they had a long-standing school integration program where African-American students attended suburban public schools. It was fiercely resisted at first. But over time, because there was money flowing with these children to the suburban schools, you had white Republican suburban state legislators backing a continuation of the program because their school districts had become reliant on that funding. The best programs are not one-way, but two-way, because we don't want to have simply students leaving cities to go to suburban schools. And so in Hartford, they have a terrific system of magnet schools that have long waiting lists of white middle-class parents in the suburbs who want their kids to go to these urban schools in Hartford. Hartford is one of the poorest cities in the entire country. If they can do it in Hartford, they can do it anywhere. And they were able to do it because the programs were attractive to families. So a lot of times, a school district will just say, well, let's try an arts magnet or let's try a magnet based on STEM. They kind of they do it as guesswork. But what the more sophisticated districts are doing is surveying parents and finding out what sort of programs would be attractive, including families that are now sending their kids to private schools. What would it take to get your kids to consider going to the public schools? And then they have this equity component to make sure that the programs that are designed are developed in a way that are going to be open to students of all backgrounds, not just the wealthy students. So we've learned a lot about how to integrate schools in the past 30, 40 years, and there are a growing number of successful examples of bringing kids of different backgrounds together.
I want to say just a couple of quick things. Beyond I think the integration, whether by race or by class, while that's very important, I want to speak a little bit directly to the finance piece of this, and what we mean by equity and what we're trying to accomplish with fair funding formulas to allocate resources. I have yet to see a state that has hit this right. I think the crux of the issue is really trying to define what the goal is. So long ago, I think the goal was equal. It wasn't even the goal, but the concept of equity was equal funding, and how far are we from equality in funding? What are the disparities? What are the differences? And we've moved from that concept of conceiving equity as equal funding to trying to understand equity in terms of equal opportunity. That is a much more slippery idea than looking at equal dollars per pupil, for instance, which again we never really accomplished, but that was sort of the gold standard. Right now, the operating term is this notion of adequacy, that we fund so that everyone has an adequate education. And I think that's a fairly lofty goal because adequacy is driven by outcomes. We want students to be able to achieve these various kinds of outcomes, and we need to fund a school system that will provide the opportunity for every child to achieve those outcomes. Again, this is tricky because we need to be defining outcomes that we can measure, that are actually meaningful. And so the devil is really in the details right from the beginning when we're talking about adequacy in terms of recognizing outcomes that are A, meaningful, and B, measurable. We also need to recognize that adequacy is a floor. It really is the minimum resources and dollars that are needed in order to realize these outcomes. And I'm not sure that's really what we're aiming for when we're talking about equal opportunity. Now, this doesn't get to, I'm trying to fill in a gap here. This doesn't exactly get to this question about concentrations of poverty. I happen to agree with Richard that there is consensus in the education field and in the social sciences that poverty status is one thing, but then concentrations of poverty add an additional disadvantage. Truth in advertising, I feel like I just need to say this, that I'm part of a team that is a subcontractor to these consultants, so I'm kind of anxious to go back and talk to them a little bit about this claim that they're arguing that concentration of poverty doesn't work. It's something I'm interested in following up a little bit on. So.
You can educate them.
I'll try. I want to ask, I guess, an important last question here. We have about 10 minutes left. Where do you see the teaching profession in 10 years? And we'll start with you, Jennifer.
So I think that's the million-dollar question. One of the most interesting dissertations that I have directed in the last, I would say, 20 years was a student who was interested in the question about how do we get the very best students, most talented, most motivated, who are interested in teaching to actually go into the teaching profession. That we lose a lot of these students to other professions while they're in their undergraduate and in their early career years. So what is it that's either drawing those people in or repelling them from the profession? And I think this is a really big question because the teacher pipeline starts early. And how do we get those people to come into the profession? So her study revealed some really, I think, interesting findings, some that are disturbing because there's not a lot we can do about them in the short term, but I think some that have a lot of policy relevance. The more disturbing findings were things like, I've always been smart, I've always gotten good grades, and everyone says I can do better than being a teacher. I find that to be really, really troubling. And I think we need to change the message that we're sending to young people about what it takes to be a good teacher, how rewarding this profession is, and how incredibly impactful it is to have good, smart people enter the teaching profession, go into schools that need the best teachers, and stay in those places to realize change. Now, another one of the issues that I think affected those young people and affects teachers in difficult-to-staff schools has to do with the support that teachers are getting in those places. No matter how committed a person is to their career, and I don't care whether you're a teacher or an architect or an engineer, if you cannot be effective at your job, it's unlikely you're going to stay in that job. And I think we have many, many schools where it's a near impossible task to be effective, to realize the goals, particularly if we define them narrowly in terms of test scores, that we've set for teachers in those schools, and then to have accountability systems that publicly indict teachers who are in classrooms where the students aren't realizing those goals. So I think it goes back to a lot of the forecast that I laid out in my brief comments up front about how we need to rethink accountability systems so that they reward and not just punish, so that they recognize what it is teachers are able to accomplish, and support teachers in doing that work, and support schools as organizations in doing that work. And that's where we get back to questions like comprehensive wraparound services, and what a particular school context may need in order for teachers to be effective. So, it goes back to a lot of the things I talked about earlier, of teacher evaluations that use multiple measures, that recognize the complexity of their work, perhaps that reward teachers to work in particular kinds of environments, but supports to help teachers to be effective in the most challenging environments.
If I can add in, Liz mentioned at the beginning that I wrote a biography of Al Shanker called Tough Liberal, and if there was one thing, I know he was AFT rather than NEA, so I don't know how people feel about him in this room, but he was all about making the occupation of teaching a profession, a genuine profession. And so there were many, many different pieces to that, but I'll just hit on a couple. One, obviously, was to compensate teachers like true professionals. And so you shouldn't have this enormous disparity between what teachers make, even when you count in the summers off, compared to people who have comparable levels of education in other fields. A second piece had to do with how we evaluate and also dismiss teachers. And Shanker was a huge proponent. I think, Julian, you mentioned the peer assistance and review. He was for that idea in part because you needed a political answer to the right wing, which was always talking about incompetent teachers. There had to be a way, but there was a piece of the idea that was actually ennobling of the profession, that this is what lawyers do, this is what other professionals do. They evaluate one another through peer review. It's what professors do. And so that this could be not only a way to respond to critics of teachers' unions, but also a way to elevate the profession. So that was another piece of it. I think we've got a chance here with the transition from Barack Obama to Hillary Clinton. I personally I was a huge supporter of Barack Obama's, and I was enormously disappointed with what he did in education. But Hillary Clinton seems to be interested in ending this civil war within the Democratic Party. Right, getting around common ideas like pre-K and better access to higher education, and avoiding so many of these divisive issues in K through 12, and instead focusing on making teaching a genuine profession.
Ditto. No. So I think one of the things to think about is what the last 10 years has looked like in New Orleans, because I think that's their vision for the next 10 years, which is how can we create a system of privately controlled schools. And there's one point I know this is related, but I think it's really important. I know probably many of you haven't been paying attention to what's going on in Puerto Rico, but I just wrote a piece for the Progressive magazine, and I read through that bill that they put there, and I think that there is some very scary stuff in there, which is that with a single line of legislative language, they said that all teachers in leader schools, which are essentially charter schools, are now private employees. They're not employees of the state. They're not public employees, with one very simple line, right? And so there is I believe it looks like a train of thought in the education reformers camp that now that we've created this separate system, that we can just easily transfer teachers over into into these private schools. And they also have in this bill that after 2 years, teachers can be fired if evaluated using value-added models, and they didn't really specify in the bill what that meant. So I think that there's this vision that looks like New Orleans, that looks like Puerto Rico, teachers going heavily into these charter schools and working for 2 or 3 years and churning and burning. But that's really the antithesis of what the most successful countries in the world are doing. If you read a lot of Linda Darling Hammond's work, Flat Earth, etc., you'll see that the Singapores, the Koreas of the world, that they see this as a profession. Their teachers are well paid. In Korea, they rotate their teachers every few years to some of the more difficult situations. In Finland, every single teacher is unionized, and they pay for their master's degrees. And so they have these national teacher approaches, whereas everything we do here is ad hoc. It's like throwing spaghetti against the ceiling and see which TFA teacher sticks. You know, in Texas, almost 60% of all the new teachers are alt-cert, which means that they only need 30 hours of training to hit the classroom, right? And so I think there's different visions. There's a vision where we see teaching as a profession, as my colleagues talked about, and models what the most successful countries in the world are doing, or we can model what Louisiana's doing, which is, and if you look at the data, they're last and nearly last in every single educational outcome in the United States.
So we need to wrap up now, but I thank all of the panelists for being here, and I think that everything that's been said in the last hour or so really indicates that we're really at a kind of turning point now in education, where there's going to be a lot of change in the next few years, and a lot of thinking about alternative methods. So thank you very much for coming. And is there anything else?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First, thank our final panel. Thank you all very much. Liz, thank you. All right, just a handful of final announcements. First, before you leave, if you have not already completed the evaluation that was in your folder, I should have been plugging that all along. Please do so and leave it at our checkout table. Leave it at the table where you checked in. We'll now call it the checkout table. And a couple of final thank yous. First, what a great day, very informative of our moderators and our panelists today. So thank them. Some still in the room. The audience provided so many great questions and leading questions in some ways of their own insights. And so great audience participation. I also just a couple of quick shout outs. The whole team at Calvert House, our servers at lunch, folks who helped us with our water and coffee, thank them. I want to thank Bern and the crew from MediaX Presentations for helping us be up and running and online and recording today, so thank them. Also, plug again to MarylandEducators.org to check out any of these videos. And then the MSEA staff and leaders who are in the room helped to make today possible, facilitated today, with a special shout out to our MSEA Communications Director, Adam Mendelson, who's in the back, who helped organize each and every one of these panels and prep everyone for a great show. Finally, it's my job to step aside and introduce the president of MSEA for a final word. Please welcome Miss Betty Weller.
Thank you. And I just want to say, based on everything we heard today, we have a lot of work to do. Our public schools are really important to this country, to this state, to our different jurisdictions, and we can fix these problems. MSEA is interested in working with every one of the stakeholder groups in this room to make that happen on behalf of our children and behalf of all of us. So thank you for coming, thank you for staying, thank you for everything you do, and let's roll up our sleeves and get this done.